Welcome to the Civic Brief with Dr. Isaiah Ike Wilson III, where complex issues meet everyday lives. Now, let's begin.
Welcome back, folks. And this is the WiSE segment. And I'm choosing to title this WiSE segment, Winning the Marathon, Not Just the Sprint. We're going to talk about paradox again, but again, with the WiSE, we're going to get to the practical. We're going to apply some of my WiSE proprietary strategic and operational tools and solutions, lenses, if you will, of looking at a puzzle, a problem, and an opportunity on the backside of a problem or a challenge, in ways of solving it in real, actionable, practical, everyday ways. So we're going to talk about this in terms of winning the marathon, not just a sprint. I'll explain that along the WiSE way. And then we're going to add something that we have not done in one of these WiSE segments before. I'm going to add at the end a bit of a Civics 101 in brief, right? And kind of get really down into the fundamentals, particularly from a constitutional, an American constitutional segment, kind of a Schoolhouse Rocks kind of approach to understanding the fundamentals of how we work, or at least intended to work by our founders and framers. A long time ago, up to this 250th birthday of ours this year. And in this case, the Civic 101 in brief, I want to laundry list from an American political development standpoint, what some of those historical mile-marking paradoxes have been from our beginning, from our Genesis story, and how they persisted cycle over cycle throughout the history of American political development up to this very moment we're in today. So first, I want to talk about this paradox of winning the marathon, not just a sprint. So in our previous episode with our guests, again, Lieutenant General retired H.R. McMaster, also a reminder, he's also a former United States National Security Advisor during the first Trump administration. During that conversation, we at least diagnosed a puzzle, a problem. We talked about America as a paradoxical power. We explored the tragedy of a superforce, a nation that keeps winning engagements, but struggles to secure outcomes that last. You can already get a sense of this, running the marathon as a marathon and not a sprint, right? This episode's going to be, again, different. It's about application, because the paradoxes we face as a country is the same paradox showing up in organizations, institutions, and leadership today across all sectors, governmental, non-governmental, public to private. We've gotten very good at winning sprints and dangerously bad at running marathons. So what I want to share with you here is, again, the WiSE way, how to design for endurance in an age of constant pressure and speed. The pressure of speed and the speed of pressure. Folks, speed kills. Speed kills, and we've got to understand how to moderate and govern tempo and pace. Now, I want to offer a core insight, at least what I think is the core insight here. Sprints are not strategy. For more than 20 years, as an example, the so-called period of the global war on or against terrorism, the United States did something frankly remarkable. We won nearly every battle we fought. Tactically dominant, operationally precise, logistically unmatched. And yet, when the fighting slowed, when all the battles were concluded and we won every one, the systems we needed to hold the peace often failed, or frankly, weren't ever there in the first place, those systems. The problem was not competence, far from it. It was what came after competence. We optimized for winning engagements, winning the battles, not for sustaining systems, or in this case of the vignette, not winning the peace, failing to win and secure a peace. And that same mistake now shows up everywhere. In companies that beat quarterly targets but hollow themselves out in the doing. In governments that impose order but lose legitimacy along the way. In leaders who move fast but never build trust along that same pathway. Here's the hard truth of this era. You can win every sprint and still lose the marathon. The WiSE way starts by designing for that marathon. Now, the WiSE way is not about slowing down for its own sake. It's about moving in ways that don't break what you still need tomorrow. Now, here are 4 practical moves leaders can actually use. First, name the sprint marathon tension early. Name it outright. Make it transparent to yourself and those under your charge, those that you're working for and serving. Every failure, from war zones to boardrooms, from battlefields to boardrooms, they share a pattern. Leaders act as if winning the next engagement will somehow secure the long game. It won't. It never will. The wise way begins by naming the tension before action, not after damage. We've got to ask out loud, what does winning the sprint cost the marathon? Will we exhaust ourselves at wrong pace and wrong tempo? What must still function after this particular decision that we're going to make? Now, back to the case of war and warfare. In war, we can clear the area. Certainly, win every battle and engagement along the way, we can clear the area, but can the local system hold and rebuild without us? In business, we can cut costs, but what happens to trust, talent, and adaptability in the process? Again, travelers, folks, naming the tension doesn't weaken authority. It actually strengthens judgment, your own in the collective of the team. Now I want to shift and talk a little bit about the shift from victory metrics to what I call in the wise way, viability metrics. And this finds its home in a formal theory of mine that I've been developing and applying field testing under fire to include under fire situations that I call the general theory of compound security. You've heard me talk about it on the Civic Brief before, and you see me and read what I've written and continue to write on it through the Substack Compound Security Unlocked. This idea of victory metrics to viability metrics, this is where leaders must change how they measure success. Now, what are victory metrics? We are very familiar with these. It's the dominant frame. It's the enterprise. It's the institution that we exist and operate in today. Victory metrics ask these three questions at least. Did we win? Did we hit the target? Did we move faster than competitors, right? Did we beat ahead of herd, right? What does viability metrics ask? And I'm not saying those victory metrics are wrong. I'm saying they're still necessary, but they're insufficient, right? Viability metrics need to be added. And what those viability metrics ask are these three questions at least. Can the system still operate under pressure? Did we increase resilience, or did we create an unwarranted dependency, an unaffordable dependency? And thirdly, did learning improve, or did fear along the way increase? Now, the general theory of compound security, cornerstone to the wise way, gives leaders a simple discipline designed for system performance after stress, not applause during the action, right? If your success requires constant force, constant control, or constant intervention, frankly, you didn't build anything, and you certainly didn't build strength. You built something that's brittle. You built fragility. Now, treat legitimacy as load-bearing structure. I want to talk a little bit about that. Legitimacy is not messaging. Oftentimes we think legitimacy is kind of a fluffy word, an add-on, an accoutrement, right? An accessory, a moralism, right? Legitimacy is not any of those things. It's not branding. It's not something you repair with a press release, right? It's not just messaging. Legitimacy, it's what follows, and it's frankly what allows people to accept loss. It's what allows organizations to, in a real practical way, absorb mistakes and learn from them. And legitimacy is what allows institutions to self-correct. Now, when leaders chase sprint victories without that legitimacy, every setback can become a crisis. Every criticism feels like a sabotage. And every scandal escalates. This is why legitimacy must be treated like infrastructure, right? Not just a messaging or a branding notion or a moralism, but real systems and structural infrastructure. And an infrastructure that's maintained continuously, not patched over collapse or after collapse. I write about and I talk a lot about scandal in this emerging theory that I'm calling scandology. Scandal in a system raised to a transparency can lead to adjudication, rightful, legal, just, and moral judgment in a correction of behavior, in a correction of an entire system to put it back on path, on glide slope, back on target, and on an effective, legitimate pathway to success from good to great. Again, regardless of whether we're talking about a governmental institution, a non-governmental institution, public, private, business, military, et cetera, right? That's what scandal has the power of doing. And we have a history of moments where scandal was exactly that. Think Watergate, right? And what the scandal of the Watergate affair brought to transparent light through our institutions, through our Congress predominantly, through the constitutional mechanisms of impeachment, trial, and what led to a an early resignation short of a being found guilty and legally liable, right? That's a high watermark of the positive returns as a system corrective and a leadership behavioral corrective of what scandal has in our American political development storyline done for us in the past and what it has the power of doing. Folks, scandal has become something that is now today more dark and weaponized and empowering of an illiberal approach to all business concerns, governmental, non-governmental, public, and private. Scandals, in short, are not just noise, right? They're stress fractures in any type of system, to include leader systems. Now, the WiSE way teaches leaders to ask, is this scandal revealing a real system failure? Or are we using spectacle to avoid correction, or worse, using scandal to weaponize for illiberal power position? Now, healthy systems use scandal, again, to adjust and correct. Degraded systems use scandal to govern in increasingly authoritarian and illiberal ways. Now, if your organization, institution, or country manages perception instead of fixing causes, or punishes exposure instead of learning from it, you're sprinting towards collapse. You're abusing the corrective power of scandal. I want to talk a little bit. I mentioned a moment ago, this idea of, from battlefields to boardrooms. And I want to offer what I think are a generalized lesson here. And here's a lesson that now applies, I think, everywhere. In the case of battlefields, right, in the war context, war was episodic. Competition is continuous, though. Pressure is permanent. You can't sprint forever. Leaders today ask different questions. Not just can we win this, but what must still work after we do? The day after next, right? Think about Venezuela and the puzzle today. What comes next? Think about Iraq, right? I wrote a lot about this, provoked a lot of contestation over this a couple of decades ago, right? How can we have a perfect, unbeatable plan to win the battles and the war, but none to win the peace that justified and legitimized perhaps any reason for having the war and the warfare in the first place, right? And we spent 20 years on that expedition, never really finding ourselves really a route back home through a win, a true, legitimate, durable, and balanced win for ourselves and, frankly, more importantly, for the Iraqi people, right? Rinse and repeat when we talk about Afghanistan, right? In every case since, frankly. Now, it's not just about how fast can we move, but what breaks if we never stop. Now, this applies, again, across all sectors, across national strategy, corporate leadership, civic life, even personal leadership. This applies. The WiSE way trains leaders to lose far less catastrophically, right? Not just to win, but to lose far less catastrophically. Let me begin to close this segment, and then I want to go into the Civic 101 in brief piece. I want to talk a little bit in closing of this segment about endurance being the strategy. America's challenge is not a lack of power. It's certainly not a lack of force, and particularly military force or lethal force. Whether it's a policing power no longer, or less and less about protect and serve, and more illiberally directed to those who are supposed to be being served. And in a military standpoint, it's becoming less and less about protect and defend, right? And more about a more self-interested, not nation, right? Use of force and power. America, again, challenge is not a lack of power or force. It's a mismatch between how fast we move and how little we build for endurance. Again, that day after, and more importantly, that day after next. The tragedy of a superforce is not that it fights too much. It's that it forgets what must remain standing once the fighting ends. To what ends? That's the key question. Across every sector of every activity of decision making. The wise way is not about restraint for its own sake. It's about strength that lasts, that endures. That's how paradox becomes and can be converted into real power, true power, not faux power, but real power. That's how leaders stop winning sprints alone and start finishing the marathon. This has been the Civic Brief, segment 1 of the Wise Way. And again, I'm still Ike Wilson. And again, this is the Wise Way. Now, I want to really begin the ending with, I'm going to take about 5-6 minutes, and I want to give a short commentary, what I'm calling, or beginning to call, a civics in brief. And this is coming from demand signal from you, the travelers, you, the readers, right, to get more to some of the foundational ideas and concepts that undergird for the United States our founding and framing principles, and more broadly, what defines in many ways the values and the norms that are common denominator across all members of the community of democracy, small d, right? I want to talk about in this civics brief the fundamentals of paradoxical power and the American experience, an American political development experience. So what are America's paradoxical powers? What is that? What's at the foundation of that paradoxical power? America's always been powerful, again, but it's never been simple. From the very beginning, the United States has lived inside multiple compound contradictions, one that never quite resolves, but keeps resurfacing in new forms. Now, let me take us back to our beginnings. In 1776, liberty was declared universal, right? But in practice, when we allow ourselves to listen to ourselves and our own history, we understand that in practice it wasn't. By 1787, the Constitution was written to restrain power and to create enough of it to survive. That tension between ideals and enforcement, between freedom and force, has never gone away. It's simply changed costumes. Now, a bit later in our American political development, but still in the early republic, America broke its own rules out of a necessity to survive. A couple of cases in point here. The Louisiana Purchase. It stretched constitutional limits to secure continental power. It did so deliberately. We did so deliberately. We the people, right? Through our duly elected representatives. The Monroe Doctrine. A lot of talk today about the Monroe Doctrine 2.0, right? The Monroe Doctrine, the original one, warned 1823, right? It warned Europe off imperial ambitions while quietly asserting our own, right? That's a paradox. Manifest Destiny promised democratic expansion, while at the same time it delivered displacement, coercion, and war. Power grew, but so did contradiction, right? Paradox. Then came the Civil War, the ultimate paradox. The Union was preserved through unprecedented federal force. Freedom was secured through violence. Reconstruction promised equality, but its enforcement abandoned. The lesson was clear even then. Declaring principles is easier than sustaining them. Paradox. Now, let's go forward in American political development. By the turn of the 20th century, America had stepped onto the global stage, right? The Spanish-American War was sold as anti-colonial, yet it produced an overseas empire, right? The open door policy towards China and the Far East championed free markets backed by coercive access, protectionism, right? We were learning how to lead beyond our borders without fully reconciling what leadership really meant and how consistent, or not so much so, it was with those founding and framing ideas, right? Let's visit the World Wars. The World Wars intensified all that contradiction. In World War I, we fought to make the world safe for democracy, then repeated and retreated from responsibility. In World War II, we defeated fascism by partnering with totalitarian regimes. And with the atomic bomb, we discovered a new paradox, a weapon that could end wars and make annihilation permanent. Power had become existential. These are all realities, folks, and we've got to learn to come into coincidence and an equipoise, a balance with that paradox. That's how we convert paradox to real small l, small d, liberal democratic power, right? That's the underlying storyline here I'm trying to walk us through in this Civics 101 in brief. Let's keep going. The Cold War institutionalized paradox as strategy. We defended freedom through proxy wars, right? We partnered with illiberal regimes in the name of stability. And at the same time, the Marshall Plan showed another path. We did both, paradoxically. What did that Marshall Plan show in terms of another path? Strategic generosity paired with discipline. Then Vietnam shattered that balance completely, right? Anti-communism eroded domestic legitimacy. Credibility abroad collapsed alongside trust at home. America learned, again, that force without consent corrodes leadership. It's just a question of how long those lessons learned continue to be remembered, right? Now, after the Cold War, we entered what many, including myself at the time, called a unipolar moment. The Gulf War was a military success in the annals of long history, right? An undeniable military success, but at the same time with no long-term political settlement. NATO expanded to secure peace and planted the seeds of future security dilemmas. Humanitarian interventions promised moral clarity, but delivered selectivity. Power was unmatched, but seeing clearly became all the more hard, so much harder. Then came 9/11. Liberty was defended through surveillance. Security expanded, executive power. The Iraq War comes. It promises democracy through regime change. Counterterrorism perfected precision, while at the same time eroding legal and moral clarity. We kept winning engagements. We struggled to secure outcomes that lasted and deserved to last. Which brings us to the now. Economic engagement with China accelerates rivalry instead of convergence. America first speaks the language of, in some respects, a retrenchment, while at the same time exercising coercive leverage globally. We defend Ukraine's sovereignty, the idea of it, but without direct intervention to assist. We rhetorically reject imperialism while reasserting spheres of influence within our own hemisphere, our expanding hemisphere. The pattern hasn't changed, fellow travelers, only the tempo. Now, here are the enduring paradoxes that define this particular moment. A republic built on ideals, but with imperial reach. Unmatched force paired with fragile legitimacy. A global leadership strained by domestic polarization. Freedom of action, but a freedom of action that is increasingly colliding with the rules-based order we actually help build. These are not failures of character. They are structural tensions. The danger is not that they exist. The danger is pretending that they don't. Because when a nation refuses to name its paradoxes, it starts to act blindly. It sprints when endurance is required. It mistakes dominance for durability. It substitutes force for legitimacy and speed for strategy. America's power remains immense, but power by itself does not guarantee leadership, or more to the point, a leadership deserving followership. Leadership requires something harder: judgment under tension, restraint without retreat, and the humility to admit that the hardest work begins after the action. America's story has never been about purity. It has been about correction. The question before us is not whether we remain powerful. Of course we do. The question is whether we can learn once again, how to wield power without losing the republic that gives it meaning. That's the paradox we inherit, and how we manage it will define the next chapter. Thanks for listening. Thanks for joining me in the WiSE Way. And until next time, cheers.
Thanks for tuning into the Civic Brief. Got questions, insights, or ideas? Join us at thecivicbrief.com to continue the dialogue. Subscribe, share, and be part of shaping the future, one brief at a time.